Welcome back to Awakening Israel Ministries, brothers and sisters. We're going to now get into part 6 of the Messianic Biblical Literature series. Remember, we call it biblical literature because it's nothing more than hearsay from authors that we cannot prove wrote anything. So we have all these prophecies and we have no evidence of who the authors are or that they even existed. Interesting. Let's talk about the problem with the alleged resurrection this time. Okay, so we know that there is a big debate about when Jesus actually died, if he was to rise on Sunday, right? So we've got a lot of fantastic arguments that prove, that try to justify Good Friday. If Jesus died on Friday, then it would not have been 3 days before he resurrected. Look, so Mark is our earliest narrative account of the career of Jesus. Keep in mind, Mark was the first synoptic gospel. You must know this as a Christian. You must know a little bit about your history. Okay, so Matthew and Luke basically used Mark's material to write their books, and then they added things. Mark mentions neither Jesus' birth nor his resurrection. Isn't that interesting? We got all this, all these accounts in Matthew and Luke about the birth of Christ and all this about his resurrection and coming back. And the main book that was used to write Matthew and Luke, it's not even mentioned in that book. How is that? There's no mention of Jesus' birth nor any resurrection appearances on Easter morning, according to our earliest manuscripts that end with chapter 16:8. So the book of Mark ended the oldest manuscripts with chapters 16:8. Many don't know this, but verses 9 through 20 were added later. So that gives us a lot of reason to be suspect with this doctrine. Now, how could Mark miss the birth and the resurrection of Christ? Think about it. Okay, Matthew and Luke clearly derived all major content from Mark, which was written earlier. Mark didn't mention a virgin birth or the resurrection. Did he not know? These are the relationships between the synoptic gospels. And, I didn't know what synoptic meant some time ago, so I had to, look it up. And so what it says is synoptic refers to of or forming a general summary or synopsis. So it's a synopsis of the life of Christ, a synoptic outline of the contents or relating to the synoptic gospels. So if you look here, this looks a little confusing. And if you take your time to view this chart here, you'll see that, okay, Mark was the first book, okay? And as you can see here, 76% of Mark was taken and applied to Luke and applied to Matthew. Now, you'll find double tradition in blue where Matthew and Luke are agreeing, 23% and 24%. And then you'll find all of Luke's additions that are just in the book of Luke, and that's 35% of Luke, and 20% in Matthew. So Matthew, basically, and we're just using these names, we know these are anonymous writers, and the oldest, authorship to the Gospels were anonymous. Then they were later assigned the names or the titles according to Matthew, according to Luke, according to Mark. So, of course, we have 20% of Matthew is unique. It's not in the other books. And then, of course, you have some of Mark that is only in Matthew. And then you have some of Mark that is only mentioned here in Luke. So you'll have those combinations there. But as you can see, the majority of the context in the books of Matthew and Luke comes from the book of Mark. And as far as age, Mark was supposedly written around 50 to 100 AD, and then Matthew and Luke were technically around 70 to 100 AD. Pretty much written around the same times, but they have a lot of differences, a lot of similarities, and some things that are just unique to their book alone. Okay, the gospel stories completely contradict themselves. You know, we got a lot of contradiction in these stories regarding the resurrection, brothers and sisters. Let's start with who first approached the empty tomb. So if we look, we see that Mary Magdalene, now I'm not going to read all these verses where you find them because you can look and see them here. For time, let's just read through what this material is saying. Who first approached the empty tomb? Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, there in Matthew. And we look at Mark and it says Mary Magdalene, the other Mary, and Salome. Okay, so that's material, brothers and sisters. That's a material addition because how do we tell this story? Was it just Mary Magdalene and the other Mary? Or were there three people, three women? If we look at Luke, it says there was Mary Magdalene, the other Mary, Joanna, and then there were other women. So there was this group of women, according to Luke, that first approached the tomb. And if we look at John, it says it was just Mary Magdalene. These are major. Why you don't think that's major, brothers and sisters? Christian brothers and sisters, Hebrew Messianic brothers and sisters. Okay, we're just getting started. Who did they first see at the tomb? Who did they first see? One angel outside the tomb, Matthew. One man inside the tomb, Mark. Two men inside the tomb, Luke. And no one at the tomb at all in John. Who first told Mary about the resurrection of Jesus? An angel in Matthew. A man did in Mark, and two men told her in Luke, and Jesus himself was standing there and told her in John. So how can these be? These are mutually exclusive of one another, brothers and sisters. That means you can't have both. You can't say Jesus was the first to tell about his resurrection, and then two men, or an angel, or a man. Okay? To whom did Jesus first appear? To a joyous Mary on the road. And in John it says, to a grief-stricken Mary in the tomb. Okay, what did the woman do when hearing that Jesus had risen? Or the women, excuse me. What did they do when hearing that Jesus had risen? In Matthew it says they rushed to tell the disciples. In Luke it says, that's Matthew and Luke actually. And in Mark it says they kept the news to themselves. They didn't tell anybody. You could read those verses yourself. Why are all these contradictions here, brothers and sisters, about the resurrection of Christ? How do we know which is which? Where did Jesus first reveal himself to his 11 disciples? In Galilee? So that's where he revealed himself? No, in Jerusalem, in Luke, which is different from what is said in Matthew. Or it was only to 10 of his disciples in John, right? Okay. So that is coming from How to Answer Christian Missionaries, Rabbi Michael Skoback from Jews for Judaism. I got this from his articles. And just very interesting. You know, I actually did a lesson called The Problems with the New Testament where I did print out these scriptures and go over them one by one. We're going to save time here. There's more issues in the resurrection, though, brothers and sisters. Let's take a look here. It says, note that none of the gospel writers was an eyewitness. So none of the writers of the gospel was actually there, but this is where we get the accounts of the resurrection from the gospel writers, but none of them were there. Many of Jesus' followers didn't recognize him in the post-resurrection stories of the gospels, and many doubted that anything even happened. You can see that in Matthew, Mark, Luke, where these statements are being made, and John. Now, Jesus allegedly told the rabbis that his resurrection would be a sign to them, yet he never later appeared to them. So why didn't he appear later to the Jewish rabbis when he claimed that that would be what he would do, and that would be a sign? Okay? Now, if we look at these scriptures, I actually listed the scriptures here in the summary, but I broke them down. We actually, pulled them out, and When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. So how do we know that the ones who doubted really didn't have justification for their doubt? So I'm not saying from this particular scripture only that it didn't happen. I'm simply saying you got two sides of it. Some of them believed it, some of them didn't. In Mark it says, and they, when they had heard that he was alive um, and had been seen of her, believed not. So some of them didn't believe it. And they went and told it unto the residue. Neither believed them. So you got a lot of the disciples saying, hey, we don't believe this is true. Other people are saying it's true, it's not true. But when you just hear preachers talk about it, they're saying he revealed himself to 500 people and all of his disciples, and he walked with them for 40 days, which is different in different scriptures in the New Testament. But even so, we don't have any proof of that. In Luke it says, but their eyes were holden that they should not know him. Interesting. And when she had thus said, she turned herself back and saw Jesus standing there and knew not that it was Jesus. This is Mary. How come she didn't know that was her son? But when the morning was now come, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples knew not that it was Jesus. I've heard different pastors, say, oh, Jesus was morphing into different shapes and he didn't want to reveal himself. And well, that doesn't lend us any proof if he's morphing into different looking people. How do we know it's him? How do we know it's just not a different person? How do we really know that? In Matthew 12:38 and 40, we're talking about the scribes, and of the Pharisees answered, saying, Master, we would see a sign from thee. And he answered and said, adulterous nation will not see a sign, but the sign of Jonas, 3 days and 3 nights in the well of the belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. All right, so he's not revealing himself to these Pharisees and proving, saying he will give them a sign, but he strictly said it right there in Matthew 12:38 through 40, that's the sign that he'll give them when they ask for a sign. "3 days and 3 nights, Good Friday." We've looked at this, and many of you already know about this kind of thing. We'll take a look though. He said he'd be in the belly, of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights. Yet we worship and celebrate Good Friday, but as you can see, 3 days and 3 nights would have made for him to rise on Sunday. He would have had to have been killed on Wednesday. I know that first thumbnail said something different, but this is the one that really spells it out for you. I'm not going to read all those scriptures. You have plenty of time to take a look at that on your own. Now, our summary here on the issues of the resurrection. Okay, the fact that Christians have sacrificed their lives for their belief in the resurrection doesn't prove that it happened. I mean, just because you all believe doesn't make it true. Okay, anything, any assertion or statement or premise that is made without proof can also be removed, disregarded, dispelled, and dismissed without proof. It is a law of logic, brothers and sisters. Virtually all religions have martyrs willing to die for what they believe to be true. Aside from the alleged resurrection of Jesus hanging exclusively on the weak thread of the New Testament garbled accounts, a resurrection wouldn't prove that someone is the Messiah, even if it happened. The Old Testament does not speak of any resurrection of the Messiah, brothers and sisters. Look at the Old Testament. It is the foundation of the New. This is a false doctrine, and this is the end of lesson number 5. Actually, it's 6. So thanks for viewing and checking out the lesson. Stay tuned. We've got lesson 7 coming up shortly.